just had the Trump announcement that the Strait of Hormuz is open, quote unquote, open to international traffic now because there's a pending deal with Iran, which will allow free passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Uh, what are your thoughts first on that?
Well, there's always an upside when warring parties at least put down their guns for a little while. So, I think that it's important to welcome any move, however small and however potentially temporary they are, towards peaceful resolution of conflicts. Number one. I think number two, though, is there are probably more questions raised than answered as a result of this MOU. One is, of course, the likelihood that the MOU will actually get signed. That's the first one. There's what's the English saying? Many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, and there are a number of days yet to go, and no doubt there are forces at work that are not supportive of even this particular pathway. So that's the second thing. From a longer term point of view, it does raise a lot of questions. One, around the US position from a security architecture point of view in the region. Secondly, the status of Iran really as a regional power. Thirdly, the extent to which any agreement can be reached within the 60 days, and how good that agreement's going to be in the long run. Is it going to actually lead to a long-term stabilization of the situation in West Asia, or is it another short-term interlude between outbreak of conflict once again? Let's not forget that Israel and the project of Greater Israel has been the centerpiece of American foreign policy in the region for many decades, and of course is the centerpiece of foreign policy and regional policy from the point of view of the Netanyahu government. And this particular MOU goes a long way in the opposite direction to the Greater Israel project. So I do worry that this is nothing more than a stopgap measure aimed at buying time, and ultimately does not lead to a longer term resolution of the problems. I hope that it does create some room for negotiations and statecraft to prevail to arrive at something that can actually work across the region. And I think we've discussed before the Chinese initiatives when the Iranian foreign minister visited Beijing a few weeks ago, where both of them, the Chinese foreign ministry and Arachi, commented on the desirability of there being a new regional security architecture developed and anchored by the countries of the region itself. In other words, without the United States, in the spirit or under the principles of good neighborliness. And it often takes a little bit of time to bring disparate perspectives together, and hopefully this creates a window for that. The pessimist, of course, would always say, well, look, the Americans aren't going to change their view. They're really just buying some time. The Israelis are going to stick to their guns, literally speaking, and we'll be lucky if we get to Friday when this MOU is meant to be signed. And even if it's signed, we're going to be lucky that it lasts a month. So that's where it's at. I don't know whether, in fact, by the way, the claims being made about the arrangements by President Trump reflects how the Iranians understand the MOU to be. The alternative view of the MOU is that, in fact, the opening of the Straits of Hormuz will be on Iranian terms, that there will be significant unfreezing of heretofore frozen Iranian assets, frozen by the Americans, and that the Americans will also make significant, and I'm talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of reconstruction contributions to rebuild Iran and I guess other infrastructure within the region. So we've got two versions of this thing being told out there from what I've seen. and I'm not sure we're that much wiser for it.
As you say, there's still a lot of uncertainty from now. There's this 60 days trial period that remains to be seeing how both parties can stick to the agreement. As you mentioned, there are people who want to see this deal fail, well, particularly Israel and Netanyahu. They do not, they already stated they will continue their to pursue their objective in southern Lebanon, where they're steadily turning southern Lebanon into another Gaza, and Iran has said time and time again that Lebanon must be part of the deal. You know, Israel must be restrained for this comprehensive deal to work. So there's a lot of uncertainties. But I think it is a step in the right direction. There are now some in, by satellite intelligence and marine traffic monitors, there are some VLCC tankers now are reheading back towards the Gulf direction in anticipation of the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. So that remains to be seen. But what do you think about the economic impact to the world economy? We already had 3 months of, more than 3 months, 3 month and a half of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, where nearly 20% of the world's oil and gas was cut off. Um, do you think it's this reopening, if takes place? Do you think is that enough to bring us back from the precipitous of economic collapse that the world was facing before?
Well, look, assuming that the agreement does deliver some kind of safe passage through the Straits of Hormuz, and that safe passage becomes something that is insurable and reliable, then downstream actors will begin to adjust some of their planning, particularly planning in relation to long-term destruction of demand. Because one of the concerns that downstream actors have, of course, is that at some point in time, if there is not going to be adequate flows of fuel that they need for their activities at the prices that their activities can afford, then they're literally going to have to cease those activities. Now, of course, ceasing activities in the short term can take place by way of mothballing, so you can bring them back online when the energy is available. But in the long run, if supplies is going to be impaired for a significant period of time, then I think that there would be firms that will be considering how to substitute, move to alternative fuel sources, which leads to a period of permanent demand destruction whilst these transitions take place. If, however, this passage opens up, then some of those decisions can be deferred and will likely to be deferred. Having said that, we're going to have quite a number of months before the volumes of available crude oil and gas begin to recover towards the levels that existed in February this year. And that's for very practical reasons, actually. You've got to reopen some of the oil fields. You've got to repair infrastructure. You've got to get the boats in place. And reports suggest, for example, in the LNG space, that Qatar expects that they'll have something like 80% of their lost capability of the capability back into place in 2 to 3 months' time. But notice that there's a missing 20%, and that's not going to come back on stream particularly quickly. So there is some long-term damage to supply capacity. We've also got, I think, a change in perspectives on energy risk and how countries and enterprises will seek to manage that looking forward. The idea that countries and enterprises just go back to the status quo ante, I think, is not credible. Countries and enterprises have been thinking about how to reduce the extent to which they are exposed to this kind of situation in the future, in anticipation that we're in for a rocky period, and these kinds of disruptions are going to be part of the calculus going forward. And what that has meant is, of course, intensified moves towards electrification, where enterprises, supply chains, and countries can, and that's going to change the composition of demand as well over the course of the medium term. So this particular war will have long-lasting legacies because it will cause transformations, structural transformations. Short-term legacy, some demand destruction, some recovery in some months' time as supply begins to recover back to pre-war levels. But ultimately, the war has catalyzed, I think, a reassessment of energy structure and energy risk, and that will see ongoing efforts made around the world to reduce dependency on oil from the Middle East for future economic development and activity.
Well, Warwick, let's return back to some real life examples.
Yeah.
Some of the, when you mentioned states who are stuck in the old paradigm, for some reason immediately came to mind was United States. U.S. is basically doubled down on its status as a petro-state under Donald Trump's administration. On some level, it makes sense because U.S. is actually a large oil and gas producer right now, and so why not lean on your own advantage, right? And so it does is that really to the disadvantage of United States? And before you answer, and right now, Donald, I know Trump himself would say, I have been validated because the stock market is at all-time high in the U.S. In fact, the U.S. stock market has pretty much sucked the oxygen out of the global liquidity at this moment. U.S. dollar is actually appreciating in value against many currencies around the world, particularly Asian currency. I think the only exception is the Chinese currency RMB, which is actually appreciating against the US dollars. But against everything else, whether Japanese yen, Korean won, Indonesian rupiah, Filipino pesos, Indian rupee, US dollar is insanely strong right now. I know Trump will point that as validation of his own policy. What do you say to that?
Well, when we often ask the question about the benefits and the disbenefits, there is a temptation, particularly from a sort of a more Western philosophical perspective, a dualist perspective, to view these things as either ors. But I think you've touched on the fact that, in fact, benefits and disbenefits can coexist. It really just depends on who we're talking about and what durations of time we're talking about. The United States does have an abundance of oil and gas. We know that from geological surveys, but we also know that the energy cost of extracting that raw material is increasing all the time, and that the longevity of highly efficient fields, particularly for its fracking, is diminishing year on year. So, in a sense, whilst there is an abundance of material in nature, the costs of extracting that is increasing continually, which makes it ultimately a reducing energy return on energy invested proposition. That's your long run structural thermoeconomic downside. The upside in the short term is that there is an abundance of raw material that can enable the enrichment of those industries that have access to it. And so it generates a financial wealth, but at the expense of accelerating the declining systemic-wide energy return on energy invested situation for the US economy. So financially great today for some, not so great for others. We know, for example, that gas prices at the pump have been, going up. In some states, hitting over, I think from memory, about $8 a gallon, but averaging around $4-ish a gallon. That's quite high, and it really does hit many Americans very, very hard. So, where there are winners in these distributional games, there are also losers in these distributional games. But if I brought a thermoeconomics lens to this story, I would say that that the acceleration of reduced energy return on energy invested is the long-term price or the medium-term price that the US pays for short-term financial largesse. So that's a very practical piece. Attempts to electrify or expand the electrification of the US economy in response mainly to what's happening with electricity demand from AI is running into a whole bunch of barriers as well. Look, when you look at the data over the course of the last 20 odd years, you see that energy capacity or electricity capacity, more specifically in the US, has been relatively flat. The United States has not been adding much more capacity in net terms over that last 2 decades. But in more recent years, it's had a need to add substantially to its capacity, both in terms of generation, but more importantly, in terms of distribution through the poles and wires network. And there are constraints. The ability to augment the poles and wires networks with substations and new towers, new wires, is literally hitting the wall because of shortages of available materials, available equipment, and available skilled labor. And it is having material consequences with delays or cancellations of data center projects, not to mention the fact that the location of data center projects is running into their own political headwinds as well, with many communities not wanting data centers to be built in their areas, partly because of concerns that when they do get built, they cause electricity prices within local markets to rise. Now, as local markets experience rising electricity prices, households, of course, are put under pressure, but so are other industries that use the electricity. And so the rapid expansion of AI data centers is creating what we would call a Dutch disease effect, which is that it sucks resources towards the AI center at the expense of the other sectors of the economy, with downsides as well. So winners are the stockholders of listed AI companies, and those who are experiencing the downside of these dynamics are households, particularly lower income households, for whom a large proportion of their household budget is committed to staples like electricity, and other industries who can't do much about it. They're stuck with needing electricity from the grid, and that's getting more expensive. So, these are some of the practical dynamics of these energetic questions, if you will, but also how they intersect with the financial markets. So stockholders, are doing well. More liquidity is going into the stock market, and that's driving up valuations. At the same time, oil executives are doing well. At the same time, the military-industrial complex is generating profits that it's probably never seen, for many decades. They're doing very, very well. But in distributional games where there is a winner like this, and where growth itself is relatively moderate, the majority of any growth that is taking place is being snaffled up by a relatively small group of people, or a minority of people.
Well, I know people on Twitter or X would say, well, yes, there's some problems, but America will innovate out of it because US, with its unique system of venture capital, of funneling billions of dollars to Silicon Valley, will generate will have that special magic elixir to create innovation. They will point to example of Elon Musk, like who created Tesla and now created SpaceX, which made him a trillionaire. Is pointing that as example of American innovation that can go from 0 to 1, right? Like that will bring open a new frontier, and they makes a similar argument, by the way, also for AI, the investment into AI. They're saying, like, once we have AGI, you have the you have a bunch of PhDs that can basically you have equivalent of a bunch of PhD that can work for nonstop 24/7 with no sleep, no bathroom breaks, and they can train other AI, they can train other PhDs, and very soon, abundance, super abundance. What do you say to that?
Well, look, innovation is part and parcel of the human condition, right? And humans, wherever they are, have over the centuries addressed the problems that they face in different ways, sometimes in ways that are more out of the box than at other times. The United States does go through periods where it has addressed the problems that it confronts, and there is always the possibility that creative people will find answers to problems. That's the upside, right? They're not the only place in the world that does that, but certainly, I think if I was asked to nominate something about the United States and how it may be able to tackle some of these sorts of problems, I would say that it certainly does have a capacity. It's a big population. Actually, still a lot of well-educated people, creative people, and there is a chance of being able to think through these sorts of issues. But there are still material constraints. One can dream up these sorts of solutions, and no doubt many have, but you've still got to be able to have access to the raw materials to bring them to reality. And it's accessing some of those raw materials that will take time. I've said on many occasions that should the United States make importing cheap things from China, very expensive, or literally reduce or cut imported goods from China, whether they're finished products or, more importantly, capital goods and intermediate goods, well, it will have an effect on the United States economy, which may take anywhere from 5 to 10 years for alternatives to be developed. But there's no, in principle, reason why these alternatives could not be developed. The structural constraints on that, aside from this question of being able to have access to raw materials, is whether or not finance capital will mobilize in behind these activities as opposed to other things. And the reason why the United States is in the position that it's in today, structurally speaking, is because financialization has tilted the American economic system away from many of these sorts of activities, the development of the material industries, commitments to material sciences, the ongoing education of the next cohort of relevantly skilled people, etc., etc. Now, you don't get any of that happening overnight unless you're willing to open up the borders and enable people with those skills to come into the country. At the moment, that's something that the country, seems to me anyway, is a little bit hostile towards. So, these are the barriers, if you will, that the United States is needing to address, whilst at the same time being optimistic about the innovative and the creative potential of the country and its people. My own view has been for a long time that unless Wall Street is essentially brought to heel, it will always, ironically, be a drag on the capacity of these other parts of the economic system to rediscover their mojo.